Welcome to week 2 of social contract theory and forms of justice. This week, we're going to be talking about different forms of social justice and what has been defined as social contract theory, who came up with that, and that history. But before we actually begin on the lecture, I wanted to briefly have a review of the other materials that are available for you this week. For your reading responses, I have provided an outline here of a checklist you should be reviewing before you submit your final post. As a reminder, each discussion posts are due by Friday, 5 p.m., no exceptions. One key thing that I grade on is I don't want to just read your summary. I've already read the readings many times, and I mostly want to know about your analysis, your response, and the questions that are outlined here below. The other thing that you want to think about is that you're discussing all of the content, and that includes the videos as well as the readings that are on the syllabus. Also include questions, so I don't expect everyone to fully comprehend the readings. That's not possible, but I do want you to share questions or terminology or things that you disagree with. Also keep in mind basic proper essay format, so intro, body, conclusion. So I don't want to see like bullet points or list style. This is like a discussion based response. And then make sure that you're citing all of your sources. So I accept Chicago, MLA, it doesn't matter what you choose, just keep it consistent. And then for the additional content, you're going to be watching a video by Tourmaline and Dean Spade. And I want you to answer the following questions after you review the presentation that we're going to talk about in the lecture. So the first one is, what is an abolitionist framework and how does it relate to other social justice theories that you will learn about this week? And then I want you to reflect on a few of the statements that the authors engage in, and then also answer what are the 4 major components to abolishing the prison industrial complex. And I want you to both define and expand on both of these. The next thing that I wanted to discuss is the lecture. So we're gonna just jump right into that. This week, you engage with this notion of social contract theory, and it is a theory that was implemented by major Western philosophers who were considered part of the social contract or this idea of social justice. This include people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And social contract theory is specifically defined as the view that persons' moral and or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement among them to form the society in which they live. For Socrates, this meant that punishment was acceptable because it is a law of society that makes one's entire life possible. For Plato, laws in place are meant to prevent man from going to extremes. For Plato, this meant that men must submit to laws out of fear. For Aristotle, justice specifically was defined by something that rests on proportional and not numerical quantitative equality. In other words, not something that is just defined through numbers or through like a scientific measurement. He said it is based on equality according to merit. So here I provide an overview of both of these 3 scholars and the time periods that they were based in and the arguments that I really want you to focus on. Each of the slides actually have an audio clip attached to it that you can also click if you're able to download the slides and your program's compatible with it. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So if it doesn't, just watch this video instead. But Thomas Hobbes, whose period from 1588 to 1679, said that humans are exclusively self-interested, yet also rational. Without laws, people would exist in a state of nature, so-called state of nature, which would be unbearably brutal. He said, quote, "They have no capacity to ensure the long-term satisfaction of their needs or desires, a state of utter distrust," end quote. However, since we are rational, quote unquote rational, we require and submit to laws to avoid this brutality. The social contract allows for an existence outside of the state of nature. A sovereign with absolute authority is needed to mete out power, no matter how coercive they might be. The sovereign is needed to save man from brutality of the state and nature. So this is part of the social contract theory. In other words, in order for the world or society to be maintained and in control, there needs to be these forms of coercive control or coercive power, meaning that the state needs to engage in some type of force, whether this is punitive, corporeal, like in the body through punishment. There has to be something present there. For John Locke, in the period of 1632 to 1704, his arguments were used as foundations of American Revolution and US democracy. For him, the state of nature is pre-political, but not pre-moral. He believes that man is intrinsically moral and should adhere to the law of nature, wherein they are enjoined not to harm one another. Yet this morality cannot be trusted if one person declares war, steals, attempts to enslave another, and thus government is needed. Property is central to Locke's argument. It is the protection of their property, including their property in their own bodies, that men seek when they decide to abandon the state of nature. Locke rejects notions of necessity and of absolute sovereignty. And you might be asking yourself, well, what does this have to do with social justice? And one of the things that we're going to learn about is the history of these very early ideas of what it meant to own something, property in relation to whiteness, and what it meant to own bodies, other people, land. All of these different components are essential to understanding the larger history of social justice theory and social justice movements, as we'll see later on in the class. Um, for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, from the period of 1712 to 1778, he defined the invention of private property as a move towards humankind out of the state of nature into one characterized by greed, competition, vanity, equality, and vice. For him, property was part of a progressive movement in humanity. To own something meant to move towards a more progressive state. And we're going to think more in this presentation about what it means to be progressive in society and how people throughout history have been quote unquote othered based on race, gender, and sexuality. In addition to Rousseau's argument, he stated that government is created and meant to offer equality, but in actuality, it quote unquote fossilizes inequalities that private property has produced. In other words, the social contract exists only to protect the stronger and richer. To change this type of formula, Rousseau argues we must succumb to a social pact in which the sovereign is committed to the good of the individuals who constitute it, and each individual is likewise committed to the good of the whole. So those three main theorists are what would be the defining figures of social contract theory. And these formulas have been used to develop different approaches to justice. One of these approaches is equality or the egalitarian approach. Equality is actually a very contested concept. People who praise it or disparage it or disagree about it exist throughout different forms of social justice movements. But equality or to be equal to signifies correspondence between a group of different objects, persons, processes, or circumstances that have the same qualities in at least one respect, but not all respects. In other words, regarding a specific feature, differences in other features, for example, the idea that men are equal to is not the same as saying that they are identical. Equality implies similarity rather than sameness. Thinking of this idea of equality or the matter of inequality is understood as an issue of social justice, not as a single principle, but as a complex group of principles forming the basic core of today's notion of equality and egalitarianism. Equality, in its contemporary usage, has a close connection with morality and justice in general and distributive justice in particular. In other words, equality based on what goods, access people have to land, property, self-ownership, time, mobility, all of those things. From antiquity onward, equality has been considered a constitutive feature of justice. So since early times to today, equality continues to be a mainstream social justice approach. Another is utilitarianism, and this is the view that the morally right action is the action that produces the most good. The right action is understood entirely in terms of potential consequences that may be produced. It is also distinguished by impartiality and agent neutrality. Everyone's happiness counts the same. When one maximizes the good, it is the good impartially considered. My good counts for no more than anyone else's good. Further, the reason I have to promote the overall good is the same reason anyone else has to so promote the good. It is no peculiar to me. It is not peculiar to me. And the primary scholar or theorist for this idea of utilitarianism was Jeremy Bentham during the period of 1748 and 1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. And keep in mind that these dates are not necessarily important. They're more helpful just to understand a timeline of the period. You will not be tested or quizzed on any dates. The following framework is meritocracy, which is a social system that gives the greatest power and highest social positions to people with the most ability. Now, after discussing different approaches to social justice, now we're going to discuss different forms of justice. The main four forms of justice are distributive, procedural, retributive or corrective, and restorative. I'm sure many of you have heard in the recent years this idea of restorative justice, which we're going to talk about and think through. The first one, distributive justice, is based on the perceived idea of fairness in what people should receive. In other words, what access, how does race, gender, sexuality, citizenship, ability, how do all these things impact what people can access in terms of goods, social capital, employment, Medicare, all of those things. Procedural justice is fairness in processes that resolve dispute and allocate resources. So we'll discuss this a lot, how responses to police brutality and police murder really rely on procedural justice. One of the things that they rely on is procedural justice, the idea of having systems allocate justice through the legal courts, through the legal systems. And we'll see that a lot of the social movements that we're going to engage in all really rely on all these forms of justice simultaneously, while weighing heavily on others more. Corrective justice is the idea of retribution and punishment. So prison sentences, immigration detention, psychiatric hospitals, all of these are forms of corrective or retributive justice. And then finally, restorative justice is the idea of repairing harm not only to an individual, but community and society. And we're going to see how restorative justice actually really relies on all these others: distributive, procedural, retributive, corrective. But in contemporary times, it moves away from punishment and ideas of carceral logics of justice. And we're going to talk a lot about abolition and the history of that framework for this week when you read and watch the video with Dean Spade. So one of the key things about this class that is essential to understand is the differences between what's considered a social service and the framework and I practice an idea of social justice. So social services usually refer to private individual acts, while social justice is specifically about the public and collective actions that are possible. Social services also refer to responding to immediate need. In other words, like a lot of nonprofits, rapid response hotlines, managing things and issues within society immediately and not really attending to the long-term root causes of why something is causing a particular community harm. So in the social justice framework, it's something that responds to the long-term need rather than short-term. Social services provide direct service, such as food, clothing, shelter, and these also require repeated actions. So social workers usually have to communicate with folks on a regular basis to be reassessing their needs. Oftentimes referrals don't necessarily address all of the things that are going on. So in the social justice framework, it's more about promoting change within institutions and resolving structural injustices. So not just referring to the immediate needs. But I do want to make a note here that this is not in any way means a good or negative binary that I'm presenting here, more meant to structure what social services work does and what social justice work is. And as you'll learn throughout this course, transformative justice and redistributive justice also work within social service systems towards the goals of social justice. So these movements are all interconnected. As I was saying, social services also are directed at the effects of injustice, sort of like managing and mitigating the symptoms, while social justice is directed at the root causes of injustice. So it treats the disease instead of the symptoms. Examples of social service include homeless shelters, food banks, clothing drives, emergency services, which are all really, really critical to society. But social justice frameworks are also thinking about legislative advocacy, community organizing, changing policies, agricultural workers' social justice campaigns. And because of the pandemic, we really have so many different examples of specifically housing community organizing efforts in the last year that have successfully not only gained access to the land, but started to work together to organize other housing networks within the geographies that we'll learn about. Ultimately, what I want you to note here is that social justice is really aimed at social transformation. And this is where we're going to talk a lot about the nonprofit industrial complex, the way that nonprofits also work to mitigate the harm that the state causes and not really address the long-term needs. One of the main authors, activists, and scholars that we'll be engaging with this quick semester is Grace Lee Boggs, whose vision and practice is really essential to thinking about what social justice looks like in praxis, both as an activist, as a researcher scholar, and as someone who was heavily involved in anti-prison movements and religious autonomy movements, supporting all different migrant organizations as well. This is someone who had like a huge involvement throughout her lifespan. We'll be watching a lot of her work and reading a lot about her work as well. One of the things that she offers us is a notion of transformational organizing. And she states that we must define revolution both by the humanity stretching ends to be achieved and the beloved community building means by which to achieve those ends. She was someone who was a huge proponent of engaging in solidarity work with communities across ages, race, gender, and she was also involved in anti-prison movements throughout her entire lifetime, as we will read about when we read her book. Oh, and then that reminds me, quick note, for those of you who do not have access to the two texts, please make sure to reach out to me before we approach the scheduled readings. Thank you. Moving forward, we're going to discuss what is race and what is racism. What are these two things? One of the reasons why we're going to think about race and racism is to consider how it affects the social contract. Do these notions shift its terms? And if we are all supposed to adhere to it for the greater good, what if some of us believe it does not produce just results? The other question is, what is the relationship between race and property in the United States? If, as Locke argues, something is rendered property through the commingling of labor and that which is to be owned, how should we understand the racialized nature of labor in this country? From slavery to Asian and Latino laborers to sweatshops overseas, do these workers whose labor has produced so much of our nation's resources own the fruits of their labor? And why does Locke's rule of property not apply to them? So in your discussion response post for this week, I mentioned that you don't necessarily have to answer the questions that are proposed in the PowerPoints, but more specifically focus on the ones that I've outlined in the reading response section on Canva. But I definitely want you to think about these questions in the long term. And they're not necessarily easy to respond to. But for students who engage with these questions in the response post, definitely love to hand out a few extra credit points because I know that I'm already asking you a lot in terms of the questions and the summarizing. So to even provide further analysis on terms of these questions definitely warrants a few extra credit points. And just a note on extra credit point, the way it works is I typically will either add the points directly to your assignments or to one of the midterm or final exams. So throughout the semester, you'll know which ones are which. But for these response posts, they're added to the grade for the response post only. Okay, so we're going to talk about whiteness and what whiteness means. And I want you to check out this link on here that is from this website that is going to give you different examples of how people identify whiteness in terms of race and class and all these different forms. For some reason, it's not letting me scroll through, but go ahead and look at that if you have time. But the main definition that we're using to think about whiteness is from the Whiteness as Property reading that you were assigned from the Harvard Review, which was published in 1993 by an author named Cheryl Harris. On page 277, she states, "My grandmother's story illustrates the valorization of whiteness as treasured property in a society structured on racial caste. It was so embedded it is rarely apparent, the set of assumptions, privileges, and benefits that accompany the status of being white, and how these have become a valuable asset, one that whites sought to protect and those who passed sought to attain by fraud if necessary. Whites have come to expect and rely on these benefits, and over time, these expectations have been affirmed, legitimized, and protected by the law." End quote. Origins of property rights in the US are specifically related to conceptions of race and property and so-called establish and maintain racial and economic subordination. This is specifically the history and exploitation of Black labor, rendering Black people themselves property, and the very notion of property that is contingent on race. In addition, it is also referring to the conquest, removal, and extermination of indigenous life and white unwillingness to acknowledge indigenous ownership of land and resources. During the colonial period of the 1600s, quote, "The dominant paradigm of social relations, however, was that while not Africans were slaves, virtually all slaves were not white," end quote. Slavery produces, quote unquote, Negro as a social category premised on enslavability. Blackness merged with slavery, whereas whiteness connoted freedom, and this produced a particular ideology. And we're going to talk about what this means. In order for us to understand this, we need to discuss how people who were enslaved were rendered property. The very first idea comes from the 3/5 designation and representation clause of the Constitution, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It is also directly related to the usage of Black women's bodies as vessels for reproduction. Societal status is transferred through mother for Blacks, not fathers as for whites. And the very idea of Blackness related to monetary value. And this is what Harris expands on in page 279. In other words, how does whiteness become something one owns, quote unquote, owns? Classical theorists name property as that which embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right. Not only things, but human rights, liberties, power, and immunities that are important for human well-being. In other words, whiteness is what defines who is enslaved and who is free. Thus, it is something that produces, quote unquote, well-being. In regards to indigenous people, conquest produces the sovereignty of the colonizers, and Locke actually confirms this through law. He says that law confirms this. Critical characteristics of property and whiteness refer to whiteness as a traditional form of property. Quote, "Everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right. It is defined in relation to one's legal status as an enslaved or free person. It is also related to it is also related to the logic or the rationale of the expropriation, and exploitation of indigenous lands. Two, it is also related to property and expectations, meaning that white privilege is an expectation and that quote unquote whiteness as a quintessential property for personhood, end quote. In other words, and this is really, really important here because I want you to think about at the end of this class what self-ownership and property and what it means to own and have like even self-personhood, what all of these things mean and how they're related to legacies of enslavement, genocide of indigenous people, colonialism, all of these things. It's very important. The authors are not just discussing whiteness in terms of identity, whiteness in terms of privilege, but specifically in terms of ownership and property and this idea of personhood. Quote, when the law recognizes either implicitly or explicitly the settled expectations of whites and white supremacy, it acknowledges and reinforces a property interest in whiteness that reproduces, and this is very important here, that always reproduces Black subordination. The main property functions of whiteness are three things as follows. It is a right of dispossession, the so-called idea to do as one pleases. It is the right to use as enjoyment for desire, pleasure, etc. And it is the absolute right to exclude, to isolate, and to annihilate. Cheryl Harris argues that the law accepts and legitimizes whiteness as property. And you're going to learn from Dean Spade as well what this means in terms of transformative justice. Whiteness is not only about race, but race and privilege. On page 284, she states, in the realm of social relations, racial recognition in the United States is thus an act of race subordination. In the realm of legal relations, judicial definition of racial identity based on white supremacy reproduced that race subordination at the institutional level. In transforming white to whiteness, the law masked the ideological content of racial definition and the exercise of power required to maintain it. In other words, it converted an abstract concept into an entity. It reified it. So the idea of whiteness is not natural, but the law naturalizes it through the state. The state naturalizes it through the law, through the courts, through the legal system. And this expands to other forms of policing, surveillance, detention, tracking, all of these things. In the Naturalization Act of 1970, it was defined that any alien being a free white person of good character may become a U.S. citizen. In the 13th Amendment of 1865, it was quoted, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the U.S. And the 14th Amendment is from 1868 that defined all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Following these came the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the Immigration Act of 1924, which was specifically related to quotas, and the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which were all became specific exclusion acts meant to further subordinate Asian, Black, and Indigenous communities. The persistence of whiteness as property means that it structures all forms of society. It impacts employment, it impacts housing, education, healthcare, and the criminal justice system, and many, many more. Feel free to discuss in your response post about this. That is all that I have for you for this week. Please make sure to refer to the slides if you need an extra time on each. And as always, you can email me with any questions that you might have about the content or the deadlines for this week.